new book. It's about Holocaust, and what's an Ukrainian context of your new book?
Okay, so it's an excellent question. The book is called Black Earth, and Black Earth is meant to be a reference to the fertile soil of Ukraine, as well as to the possibility of a very dark future for our planet as a whole. The Ukrainian contexts are several. First of all, I'm trying to show that one of the causes of the Holocaust was Hitler's colonial campaign for the Black Earth of Ukraine. If Hitler didn't start a war to create a colony in Eastern Europe, the Holocaust would not have been possible, because he needed the war, and the war had to take place on the lands where the Jews lived. The second Ukrainian context, of course, is what actually happens in Ukraine when German power arrives, and how Soviet citizens, Ukrainians and others, react to German power. That's also a major subject of the book.
There is a small town, Berdichev, maybe you know. It was a center of Jewish community in Ukraine before the World War.
Berdichev was a Jewish metropolis, and there's a whole literature about Berdichev, and there are important writers who came from Berdichev, and it has a very, very rich past in Jewish religious and in literary history. What you're asking is a general question. In Ukraine and everywhere else, knowing who you are is partly about knowing what came before. So Americans could do a better job knowing about what Indian settlements were there before we destroyed them. Israelis can do a better job knowing about what Arab villages were there before 1948. Poles can do a better job knowing about what German towns were like before Germans were expelled at the end of the Second World War. And everyone in Europe could do a better job knowing about the Jewish cities and towns of Europe. So this is true in Vienna, where much of the center of Vienna used to be populated by Jews, and everyone has now just forgotten that and overlooks it. And it's true most pronouncedly in Poland and Ukraine and Belarus, which is where most of the Jews lived. So I would just say generally, it's very important to know, if you want to know where you came from, you have to know what came before. And that's always painful. It's painful for everyone. I'm mainly concerned about explanation. So we do have many points of view, many stories, as you say, but in the West, at least, there's an overemphasis on German and French and Western points of view, rather whether victims or perpetrators. So I'm trying to make sure that the history is a general one, that it's a European one, and then I'm also trying to explain, because I do think that we lack an explanation of how such a thing could have happened.
The history of Central Europe has been considered marginal, and now becomes popular. Why?
More and more Europeans understand that their history only makes sense with East European history. For a couple of generations, everyone in Europe and America was taught a kind of history of Western civilization, which was Greece, Rome, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance in Italy, Revolution in France, industry in England, Industrial Revolution in Germany, and then some wars. And that history included everyone who took part in Western integration, but it excluded the center and the east of Europe. People are slowly realizing that that paradigm doesn't make sense. But the second thing which has happened, of course, is that history is so much present in the news that that people have to pay some kind of attention to Ukrainian and Russian history. So, when Russia claims that there is no Ukraine, no Ukrainian history, then at least some people then ask themselves the question, well, what really is Russian history and what is Ukrainian history? I use the term bloodlands in the book to describe countries that were the object of attention from the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Although what's happening in Ukraine now is terrible, it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. Russia is not the Soviet Union. Moscow doesn't control Ukraine's domestic politics, and the powers to your west are very different. So, but to answer your question, what did you get wrong? I think everyone knows the answer to that. The answer to that is the rule of law. The rule of law is the thing which people cared about on the Maidan. The rule of law is the reason why Westerners are hesitant about investing in or helping Ukraine. And it's not an easy thing. I mean, building a state that functions is not an easy thing. But that's the most important question. I think if the Ukrainian government can build a functioning state on the territory it controls, then the war and Donbass and Crimea will eventually solve themselves.
What is the maximum of compromise for Ukrainians in the question of Donbass?
I'm not going to answer that. That's a question for Ukrainians. My general position is that the best policy for the Donbass is to reform the rest of Ukraine. It's also the best policy towards Russia.
What issues in national history Ukrainians choose to keep silent about?
Well, I mean, there are Ukrainians who work on every difficult aspect of national history. There are Ukrainians who work on the Holocaust. There are Ukrainians who've written good books about the UPA. I think probably what you need more than anything is history which takes into account all of the different points of view in the entire country, whether geographically, but also Ukrainians and not Ukrainians, so the people who inhabited the territory of Ukraine. And that's not so easy. That's a major challenge, but it has to be done. As for the question of challenging dark history, I mean, history is not always dark, but when it is dark, you have to treat it the same way. You can't treat the nice history differently than the not nice history. It's all history. You have to kind of accept it. You have to accept it all as it comes. And it's for this reason that I don't like it when the Ukrainian state or any other state tells people how to carry out historical research.
We had more of mythology in the history for USSR. Obviously now politicians try to create a new version of mythology, national mythology in history, on the base of the nationalism, for example. How to transit from mythology to narrative in history?
Myths are good for authoritarian regimes because myths provide a perfect image of something which never really exists. Narratives are good for nationalists because narratives explain everything. But a mature political nation doesn't need a myth. It doesn't even really need a narrative. It needs a history which makes sense to everyone. And that means that whether you're a Ukrainian from Zaporizhia or a Ukrainian from Zakarpattia or a Jew in Kiev or whatever it is, or a Pole in Zhytomyr, that the history makes sense. Not that you like it, not that you don't like it, but that it makes sense. You see where you fit into it. That's not exactly the same thing as a narrative. It's more of an attempt to be inclusive. Narratives tend to leave things out. So national history is possible, and I'm sure Ukrainian historians will write decent national history. But as I say, I don't think it probably slows down the process when the government issues directives about how that should be done.
How should we regard the Soviet heritage?
It has to be some kind of hybrid. It has to be some kind of mixture, because you can't say the Soviet Union never happened. You can't say this has no effect on me, because it did. It did happen, for better or for worse. It did happen, and the Soviet Union also shaped the way that Ukrainians think about Ukraine. I mean, some of the best Ukrainian writers were actually the Soviet writers from the 1920s. Who then, of course, were all killed in 1937 or 1938. So it has to be some kind of mixture. I mean, you can't reject the Soviet past entirely. That would be false. I mean, to give you an analogy, some of the best American writers were slaveholders, and so now in the United States now that would be repulsive. But we can't say, oh, we're not going to read any of those people because they owned slaves. Some of all of our early presidents were slaveholders, but we can't say, oh, they're not our presidents anymore because they held slaves. So you have to have some kind of awareness of the heritage and a critical distance to it, but also an awareness that it is part of what made you what you are. The key thing is for there to be new Ukrainian writers and new Ukrainian historians who offer things that can be in textbooks. Like, the most important thing is, I always think the most important thing is not how much you deal with the past, but what you generate in the present that's better than the past. And so, I mean, for that reason, it's like exciting Ukrainian writers, whether they're writing in Ukrainian and Russian, that's probably more important than, stuff from 50 years ago.
Is it possible that a war in Donbass is struggle for historical heritage?
On the Russian side, it is. But it's a good example of how myth can lead to violence. I mean, the whole idea that Volodymyr, that people should die, in Luhansk today because Volodymyr converted to Christianity in 988, that is insane. That's crazy. No one should think that way. We can have a nice discussion about the relationship between Volodymyr and contemporary Ukraine and Russia and Belarus. We can have a discussion about that. But the idea that it's so simple that Volodymyr is the founder of a Russian state, or even the founder of a Ukrainian state, I'm sorry, but that's insane. That it did not happen that way at all. Volodymyr was, according to the Arabic sources, he was a Muslim. He was a pagan, he was a Muslim. He converted to Christianity for entirely practical reasons, like everybody did. He had no idea that there was going to be a Ukraine or a Russia at the time, or a Belarus for that matter. He was ruling over people who were Scandinavians and Turks, as well as people who were Slavs. So these national myths from the 18th and 19th centuries, they should not cause anyone to do anything in the 21st century. We can talk about them. We can talk about where Ukraine comes from. Is Ukraine mostly about Rus, or is it mostly about Cossacks, or is it mostly about, one could say, is it mostly about the great magnates of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who are the grandfathers of today's oligarchs? Is Ukraine mostly about the open steppe? Is it mostly about the plurality of religion? You can debate all these things, but if you say like it's all one thing, like it's just about Volodymyr, that leads you to insane conclusions. And the Russian idea that Russia comes from Kiev and therefore it's legitimate for us to invade in Ukraine, it's just from a historical point of view, it's totally insane. Russia was named after Rus, but that was a self-conscious attempt to take on the tradition of Rus, right? The Muscovites, the people who were running the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, they knew perfectly well that they were in Muscovy and not in Kiev. They deliberately created this idea that they came from Kiev as their territory spread. And it's fine to study that and to know that, but to actually believe it is actually not okay. To really believe that Russia comes from Volodymyr, that's actually a mistake. It doesn't make any sense. And that people should die over that is absolutely tragic. The succession stories are always wrong. Russia arose as part of, as an element of the Golden Horde, as part of, it arose from Mongol rule, and it slowly then, it challenged the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It made war against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It reinvented itself as a Slavic Orthodox country. But Russia's history is a matter for Russians themselves to sort out. And the most important part of the history is more recent history. So where Russia comes from is what Russians themselves have done in the last 25 years, and the Soviet Union before that. What I notice in Russian historical policy is an effort to avoid actually talking about Russia and instead to talk about other things, right? So the whole business of Volodymyr and Novorossiya and Ruski Mir, it's taking Russian history and saying, well, Russian history didn't actually happen here in Russia. It happened somewhere else. And that's a way of not having a discussion about what Russian history actually is in Russia with the actual people who live in Russia or that territory in Russia. And that's that's a way that they handle a lot of issues. Rather than talking about things in Russia, and this is true of the media, it's true of history, it's true of the media, where their journalism covers things beyond Russia, but it doesn't actually cover things in Russia. And it's true of politics, where they don't talk about their own decisions. They just say that, like, the Americans did this, and therefore we can do this. So everything is pushed beyond the boundaries of the Russian Federation. And I would just say with history and with everything else, you should probably start with what's in the Russian Federation and not start from things that are somewhere else. What the good historians will always do is use the sources and write what they think is correct. And there are plenty of Russian historians that are doing that. But, Russia today shows what happens if a government goes too far in trying to control historical narrative, because people end up believing things that are not true, and there's no way to stop it. Whereas if you have a civil society and historians are free to do what they want, and they're teaching in universities and they're free to say what they want, or they're free to write in newspapers what they want, or to say on television whatever they want, then people at least have a chance to reflect. Right now, there are excellent historians in Russia. I mean, there are historians in Russia who do excellent, fantastic work, and they can even publish, but they're still on the margins. No one in the public listens to them. They do their own work, but they're on the margins, and their books are published in very small editions, and no one reads them. And that's what can't happen. I mean, that's what shouldn't happen in Ukraine. In Ukraine, historians should be able to do whatever they want, and they should be able to disagree with each other. And in that disagreement, then there will emerge Ukrainian history that people can actually believe in, instead of just like myths about this battle or myths about that battle.
To see where we will be in the future, you should understand where we were in the past. So where will Ukraine be in 20 years?
No, that I can't tell you, because it depends upon decisions that haven't been made yet. But I do think, I mean, I will say that I think that what happens in Ukraine in the next 20 years is crucial for both Europe and for Russia. Russia is trying to weaken the Ukrainian state and to weaken the European Union, which I think is very short-sighted, because in 20 years, Russians, I think, will probably have had enough of Eurasia, right? Because all of Russian history is, you go back and forth between, we're European, or we're not European, we're European, or not European, and they've shifted from claiming they're European, now they're Eurasian, and now everything's about China, and China's very popular, but it probably won't be so enjoyable to be a Chinese satellite forever. The Chinese economy is already going down, and the Chinese can't buy all the Russian natural gas, and certainly not at the prices that Russia was expecting. And after a while, Russians will probably say, okay, it's time for us to go back to Europe. And the important thing is that if Ukraine falls apart, or the European Union falls apart, then there's no Europe to go back to. If Ukraine falls apart, then there's no Europe to go back to. Because if Ukraine falls apart, then Russians will say, oh, we can never do it. So I'm sorry to put all this burden on Ukrainians, but in a way, like what happens in Ukraine, I think is crucial, not just to you, but to Europe and to Russia. Because if you Russians manage to break up Ukraine, I think that's going to signal to the current leadership that they can continue to break up Europe. But if Ukraine actually succeeds in 20 years, when Russia comes back, the Russians can look at Ukraine and they'll say, well, if even the Ukrainians can do it, then we can do it too.